Our guest today, Doug Chia, is a guy with many hats on right now. He's the head of Soundboard governance. He's blogging on that site. He's working at Rutgers Law School. He's working at Fordham Law School. He was the executive director for the Conference Board's ESG Center until about a year and a half ago, and used to work in-house at Johnson & Johnson, Tyco. He worked at Simpson Thacher, Clifford Chance, and he's been the chair of the Society of Corporate Governance. And then recently, he was the facilitator for a working group on best practices for virtual shareholders meetings. That's our topic for today. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Doug, virtual annual meetings. I think I've got 7 or 8 different Vid-Guides now on this topic, but you're the man, so we had to have one with you and talking about primarily the Q&A session, which is the heart of the meeting right now. First thing I'll say is just been a shock to me that even though there's been obviously virtual meetings and hybrid meetings as part of that forever, the pandemic really had a way of making the annual shareholders meeting much more important this year, raising its profile, whereas the overall trend with virtual meetings, I think, is a slow death by 1,000 cuts. So one of the unforeseen consequences of the pandemic is perhaps making the annual meeting definitely here to stay and perhaps more important than ever, or at least in my lifetime. So you facilitated a working group that just came out with its report yesterday, the day before we were taping this. So I wanted to go through with you the 18 different items I saw that were recommended practices when it came to the Q&A. So I'll just sort of list them off and then get your reaction. So the first one is providing instructions on how and when shareholders will be able to ask questions at the meeting. That seems pretty basic, but perhaps some companies weren't doing it. I imagine some weren't. And making that disclosure in the proxy, as well as perhaps posting those instructions online. 2, making it clear that a shareholder must attend as a verified shareholder, not be a guest, to be eligible to ask questions at the meeting. And as I understand it, for some companies, they did allow guests. Companies don't have to allow guests. But the whole control number thing can be sometimes confusing to shareholders. And so companies had different approaches about whether they would allow guests. But even if you were a guest, you were not allowed to ask a question. As I understand, you attended 20 or so meetings and you were blogging about them on Soundboard, making you the foremost expert in the world on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the stats, most companies allowed guests to watch, but just didn't allow guests to ask questions, but some did.
The third thing was explain any requirements or limitations on asking questions at the meeting. So for example, the overall time allotted for the Q&A session, or the time allotted per question, the number of questions one particular shareholder could ask, and then self-identification of a shareholder when they're about to ask the question, and then how the company may use discretion when selecting questions to answer. And the few proxies that I read about what they disclosed about virtual meetings, I didn't see a lot of disclosure about all these different topics. But again, a lot of companies had to make a quick pivot to the virtual meeting format last year. This year could be different.
I mean, here's where was a big, change. I don't know if it's a game changer, but a big change from what you would normally do, because normally you have people in the audience. You say, all right, anyone want to ask a question, come up to the mic, or a mic will be passed around. This time it's like there's no mic. You've got to type your question into this little, field and submit it. And you can do that anytime during the meeting. And then, so you don't get your 2 minutes in the spotlight. You just get your question and hope they read it and hope they answer it. So a totally different dynamic for everybody. And I think, the companies, they need to get used to this method of intake for questions. And then a lot of companies, they couldn't control, in the audience, in a live meeting, it's, everybody please only ask one question. With the video, they couldn't control that. It was I lobbed in 4 questions once, and more than one got read because they had no idea it was coming from me. And if I wanted people to know it was coming from me, I had to actually type my name in there. Or if it was something that I was hoping the company would get back to me if they didn't get to it in the actual session, you actually have to type your email address in there. Otherwise, they have no idea that it's you. So these things are a lot different.
In general, do you, as I understand it, in-person meetings, typically if a company has a time limit on a particular question, I usually is about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Have you seen a trend going one way or the other, making the allotted time longer or shorter in virtual format?
Well, so the time limitation really applies to the shareholder proponent statement now. I haven't seen the companies really change that. They gave them the same amount of time. I think there are a lot more shareholders who kind of are preparing the recording and sending it in, because then they can really make sure they get the time right. And I didn't see, maybe there was one, well, at GM actually allowed people to call in with questions and kind of speak them online, like, radio style. There was one person who just kind of droned on, and they cut him off eventually. They just told them to wrap it up. But this was a person who comes every year and kind of waxes on about something. So they were prepared for that.
So when you're about to ask someone to wind up, do you think you start with some soft music first, gradually make it louder, and then bring out the...
Yeah, you can't, there's no red flashing light anymore or clock. Yeah. So, you just do it that kind of delicate way, like, excuse me, Mr. Romanek, I'm not hearing a question here, or something like that. So
yeah,
it takes a delicate touch, unless you want to just cut off the mic, which you can. So
yeah. But it's harsh, and we're going to talk at the end of this about
some of what the companies do is probably unnecessarily, abrupt, I would say.
So that's something to be mindful of. The number 4 recommendation was explain whether and how the company will respond to questions after the meeting that it wasn't able to answer during the meeting. And I would think this was even rarer that companies did this.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying that, unless as a shareholder to actually put your contact information out there or into the box, the company has no way of knowing how to get back to you. Now, some companies, what they did was they just said, okay, the questions that we get that we don't get to, we will post them, the questions and the answers, in written form on our investor relations website, within the next couple of days. And so then it's like, okay, not only do they get back to that person, but everybody can see it. So there's full people can benefit from having seen and the question and the answer. But this is where, some of the shareholders got worried that, that the company could just ignore things, or they can pick the ones they like and dispose of the ones that were, highly pointed questions or something like that. And it's hard to see how you can really keep the company honest on that. You pretty much have to trust them.
And Microsoft is one of those companies, they just held their meeting December 2nd that does post at least some of the questions that they answered, maybe during the meeting and afterwards.
Well, Intel's been doing it for a long time now. So, Intel's kind of proof that if you do this year after year, you'll get better at it, because they've been doing it for 10 years now. So they've kind of got it down, and they've seen like some of the little, hiccups that can go on and how to avoid those. So some companies actually did experiment with posting all of the questions on the screen. And so Tesla actually had their meeting in person, but it was outdoors. And Elon Musk was on a stage, and there was a huge screen behind him. And the screen had all the questions kind of being fed in, and people were able to like certain of the questions. And so when Elon Musk turned around and said, okay, let's go to the questions, he said, okay, this one looks pretty popular, let me answer that one. And that's, we see that in a lot of the webcasts that we attend. And so, hopefully companies won't be afraid to use that type of technology. And I know Broadridge and Computer Share are trying to, have that feature for their platforms, because this year it was very, very basic. Or most of the companies didn't want to elect to have those features just because they were, pressed for time, and they didn't want any surprises in terms of, how that technology might look on the screen. But, the hope is that more companies get innovative with this kind of thing, and shareholders will like it and will reflect well on the company.
Yeah, the SAVE platform is interesting. Of course, you have to have a lot of attendees if you're crowdsourcing like that, and because you need enough people to vote on the questions, so that and have enough attendees so that people are asking questions. So
yeah, you
I think
kind
it's
of
only
need a
those companies that
critical
have
mass.
large attendance.
So so Tesla's been using the SAVE platform for their earnings calls, and so they've got some experience with it. So it just takes some time and willingness to experiment, and not be so afraid of things that could go wrong, or glitches, or those kind of things.
So the fifth recommendation was that if a company chooses to solicit questions in advance, it provides instructions about how to do that. So in asking for questions in advance, I did it for my webcast for years. For the first few years, I got some questions in advance, and then for the last 10 years, I didn't get any. So that might be the same
Well, I
lifespan
know
of questions
that
for.
some companies, companies are making kind of decisions well in advance. Are we or are we not going to solicit questions in advance? I know a number of companies that they've decided not to, because they are worried about, opening up the floodgates. And yeah, people ask questions in advance and we don't want to answer them. What do we do then? So it's kind of very like lawyerly thinking of, is there really an upside, and is there only a downside here? But I think more companies will realize that asking for questions in advance allows them to give a more kind of thought through answer, and which should be beneficial for everybody. I know some shareholders are very skeptical that these kind of the answers really scrubbed by lawyers just don't look very authentic, and it's very party line. And they want the directors and the CEO to be able to answer questions on the spot and see how they react and see what their answers are, because that's that's a reflection of how transparent the company is.
Yeah, I agree. And then there's 4 recommendations in the report about the platform. Number 3 is the most interesting one for me. So the first one is that the platform, Broadridge, Computer Share, Media, and what have you, provide a prominently visible and simple mechanism for shareholders to submit questions throughout the meeting. Number 2 is to clearly instruct the shareholders that when they're submitting the questions, that they identify themselves and provide any contact information. Number 3 is that all the questions are visible to the company verbatim and in real time. That's the one I think is really interesting. And number 4 is that the service provider, the platform provider, authenticate the identity of the shareholder asking the question. So number 3, having the questions visible to the company verbatim and in real time. So that'll be interesting to have all the attendees be able to see what is being asked. I guess if there's a lot of questions, I actually did a chanting yesterday. Krishna Das does this chanting every Thursday real time and on YouTube Live, and everyone's posting compassionate remarks. And there's millions of people throughout the world, not millions, but hundreds. And so it's going so fast that you can't really read what is happening. So it depends how many questions are being lobbed in. If there was a lot, like the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, you might not be able to really follow the questions. So it will be interesting to see what the platform providers do, so that if the questions might fly by, or if they're really, you can somehow toggle and remain on one.
Well, I mean, this particular point was actually targeted more at kind of, the back, the back of the video, so to speak, where it's the corporate secretary who has to deal with all the intake. And that's where, the corporate secretary in some instances can't see who submitted the question. That, this has to do with different service providers and, the nobo obo and privacy, and, brokers don't want their clients' names revealed and stuff like that. And so that's, kind of a problem for the company if they have no idea who's asking the question, unless that person self-identifies. And, even if they self-identify, who knows if they're giving their real identity. And so that's why, point number 4 is trying to verify who is asking the question. They are a shareholder because they were able to ask a question. So again, it goes really to that whole debate over, should a company know who its shareholders are? And we've seen that, for years that's been a huge conflict.
Then there are 9 recommendations based on the actual proceedings of the Q&A. The first one is allocating ample time for the Q&A session based on the questions that have been received in advance and are reasonably anticipated. Ample time, it's going to depend on, the company will look and see how many attendees came last year to our pandemic meeting. And do we have any big issues going on at the company that might lead more shareholders to be tuning in this year?
Yeah. So, here's the advantage of asking for questions in advance, because then exactly, okay, looks like how much time we should allocate. And the companies that have had issues during the year, they're going to know that there's going to be a lot of questions. But what you saw this year, and shareholders had complaints about this, was that companies seem to say, okay, we're out of time, like at the half-hour mark, or clearly they were trying to get the show done within an hour. And the question is, well, why? Are they, are they limited? Will did they only put enough quarters in the machine for the lights to be on for 60 minutes or what? And so, but there were some companies that basically answered questions till the cows came home, Citi being one of them. And I think Citi, at their in-person meetings always did that. And so if the idea here is for the virtual meeting to get as close to the in-person meeting as possible, which I think most people agree should be the goal, then you would do that. Unless at your in-person meeting, after a certain amount of time, you say, okay, well, the next one's going to be the last question. And I know a lot of companies do that because they don't want to be sitting there forever. But for that, even if the CEO says, okay, we're out of time, come back next year, as the crowd is leaving the room, people can go up to the front and find someone from the company and engage with them in kind of a one-on-one dialogue. And that's one thing that some shareholders were saying, that we're kind of robbed of that at the virtual meeting. And that's an important part of, developing relationships between shareholders and companies, especially retail shareholders, and that should be mutually beneficial. And so that is one area where, it's going to take a few extra steps to replicate that type of experience. Or there has to be just kind of another mechanism for something equivalent to happen. And maybe something better.
The next few of these are sort of procedural, explaining the order in which the company will be answering questions, whether the company will take multiple questions from a single shareholder, having each shareholder identify themselves before asking a question. And then number 6 is recite to the best of its ability each question verbatim as submitted by the shareholder, rewording or paraphrasing only when necessary to make it comprehensible. So that's sort of an art to doing that if you're going to paraphrase, and you have to be careful that you don't purposefully, intentionally change the meaning of the
Yeah.
question.
You kind of neuter the questions if these are, critical ones, or yeah, you massage them to make them, you defang them, whatever you want to call it, or yeah, you say, okay, well, a bunch of people ask questions on this particular topic, and so we're just going to deal with this topic and give an answer. And so you don't get to hear your question, your particular question asked. It's kind of like, well, they just kind of bunched up a bunch of questions that could have been all, very specific questions. And the company just decided, all right, we're not going to take those specifics one at a time. We're just going to give this like stock answer that may or may not answer the question, kind of like in a political debate. There's the question, and there's the people giving the answer to a different question. And what are you going to do about that?
Or changing a question like, the company had a crappy year to the company had a surprising year. I mean, if there was profanity or somehow
challenging year, right?
I mean, it's okay to change a few words, I think, to make it appropriate, but not to change the meaning. Number 8, have members of the executive team and the board committee chairs, the board chair and attention, have the ability to audibly answer questions during the Q&A session as appropriate. That goes to an important point, I think, in that getting participation from someone other than the CEO, the corporate secretary, the general counsel, getting the board involved if necessary.
Yeah, well, this is one where it might not have happened at the in-person meetings, but I think most companies, for their in-person meetings, they do have their executive team there, or they have specific subject matter experts in the audience because they know they're probably going to get some questions. And it's better for, the chief sustainability officer to answer some of the questions than the CEO, because that person just knows more about the subject and give a more kind of, a richer answer. And so, on these virtual shareholder meetings, it gets a little more complicated when you want to have like 5 or 10 other people on call. And then there's kind of, little technical breakdowns that can happen. I think this year, one of the big problems was that these people, the executives and the board members, were all piping in from different locations, as we all know why this year. Whereas in the past, you would have all those people sitting on, chairs next to each other in a studio. And then it's, you can just say, well, Sally here is going to answer that question, and then she can just answer, as opposed to, operator, can we like unmute Sally's mic? And sorry, Sally, you're on mute, and all these things we see in our everyday Zoom calls. There was actually one company, I won't name them, but the CEO started out his, kind of management presentation on mute for like 30 seconds before someone was able to tell him, probably by text or something, that, hey, you're on mute, we can't hear you. Little bit embarrassing, but I think everybody understands that, in today's world, there's no conference call that has been held where that didn't happen at least once, right?
Well, that's the motto of 2020. Definitely, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's like the bingo game, the mute, the dog barking in the background, that kind of stuff. So
you were kind enough to review a draft of my deep dive article for my January issue of The 5. Yep. So let's go through a few of those. One is the largest shareholders are watching, as I've heard in a number of my other Vid-Guides, that this year larger shareholders showed up at some of these annual meetings that perhaps had not attended before. And I know you attended quite a few of these meetings. Were you seeing that?
Well, I don't know if I was seeing that, because I didn't see most of them, or I didn't see any of them ask questions. But I have heard anecdotally from some of the largest shareholders that they did tune in. where ordinarily they would not go travel to any of these meetings. And so, yeah, it gives an opportunity for your largest shareholders to watch what you're doing. So in the past, it was some companies were like, look, no one comes to these meetings, and the people who do come, they're basically people who don't have anything else to do on a Tuesday morning in April. And they're willing to take a train to New Brunswick or wherever to watch these meetings. But no one, BlackRock is not getting on a train to come and sit at our meeting. But now it's like, well, someone from BlackRock probably is tuning into your meeting if there's something that they're really curious about how you're going to answer. So companies have to realize who might be in the audience, and the kind of the level of question, the level of answer you give has to be satisfactory to a broader audience and some of the more sophisticated investors as well.
And I think they're not tuning in just for the substance. Of course, they are tuning in for substance, but they're also looking at how you're running the meeting. They're looking for that tone at the top.
Oh, yeah,
procedural stuff.
absolutely. And so, you can tell a lot about the company in terms of how it runs the meeting. You can tell if they're trying to be transparent or they're just trying to get it over with in record time, and how they treat the shareholder proponents and all of that.
Another point I made in my newsletter is about the media writing articles about how your meeting was conducted. Since you're quoted in a number of articles because of what you've been blogging about, you can attest to that.
Yeah, so I think the media has also taken an interest in how these meetings are proceeding, and they're taking note of particular companies. So again, it's, you just don't know who's watching. Even anyone can just enter as a guest, and you're not really taking down names, or I guess you are taking down names, but you might, maybe you should go through and see who actually attended, kind of like companies go through and see, all right, who actually called in to the quarterly earnings meeting, and lo and behold, some reporter from the Financial Times registered. So, so you better be aware of these things. I'm not sure that will continue, just because I think this year there was, the novelty of this thing made some reporters tune in just to see, kind of like me, like, okay, what is this? How are companies actually going to be able to pull this off? And how is it going to go? So, maybe over time, media, they just tune into a meeting that they think is going to have some controversy.
Although now with, this best practices report, the recommendations in it, and the expectations that companies are hearing from investors, to the extent you do not conduct a meeting that doesn't have a good tone at the top this year, I think you're going to be an outlier much more than last year, because I think that the message should have been heard by now. So maybe a reporter would report out something after the fact. They'd talk to people that did attend and find out what transpired, or, you might have recorded the meeting. I mean, in the past, a lot of companies, confiscated your phones, put them in bags and set them aside, so that all the attendees couldn't be a de facto reporter and videotape the proceedings. Now, when you have it online, you can't, you're not precluding someone from recording it, even if you don't upload an archive of your meeting yourself.
And so this brings up a point, was a bone of contention for a lot of shareholders, which was almost all of the meetings this year were audio only. And so obviously audio, you're just not able to get as good a sense of the people, doing the talking. And so they'll post a recording, but it's not as revealing. And so that might make companies more hesitant to do video, because they'd rather be behind the velvet curtain. But that in itself says something about the company. I think companies that did video this year, it was really appreciated. And interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, it was more of the tech-oriented companies that did video because, you know, it's very on brand and they want to kind of show that they're technologically advanced. This year there was, you know, some companies were forced to do audio even though they wanted to do video because the service providers were just inundated with requests. But, you know, next year, everybody should be prepared and optionality should be there. And, you know, there are probably not as many excuses for, you know, not giving people the full package or the hiccups and that kind of stuff. I mean, I think everybody realizes at this point that most of the spring meetings, it's going to be virtual again, because as we know of you know what's going on with the pandemic. But you know that's why you know this group wanted to put out this guide in time for people to prepare, because we know that there's going to be higher expectations, and we also want people to know, you know, here's basically like a checklist of, if you're going to do it, read this and follow it, and you should be, you know, it'll be appreciated. It's not like you're going to pass on everything, but it should be helpful.
Let's wrap up by talking about shareholder proponents for a moment. I know in some companies they allowed the proponent to tape in advance their remarks, like you said, so that they could ensure they meet the timeline, the deadline that they have, but also so it's a well-prepared. And then the benefit for the company is they can see what's going to be said. What do you see out there?
I think more shareholders will take the opportunity to do this because, yeah, I mean, if they're able to record their answer, they can do multiple takes, make sure it sounds as good as possible. And then there's much less chance for there to be kind of interference or something going on when it's actually happening. I know some shareholders this year, when you know the line was open for them, there was some confusion or some, you know, some very coincidental like breakdowns, or just the sound wasn't good or anything like that. And so, yeah, it takes away that, you know, for everybody, it's better because you can, you can basically, you know, pre-produce it. And there's less opportunity for something to go wrong that way.
Yeah, nothing worse than a tech snafu. I mean, I've been pretty lucky in making these Vid-Guides. It's only a few people where they live in a certain part of the country where the internet's not that great. And sometimes you get that 1950s crosstalk on a party line where no matter how many times I
Zoom bombing, yeah, all that.
I always hear someone else. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for your time and expertise.
Anytime, Brock. Thank you.